guys, today I want to tell you something about the Pacific Ocean. Pacific Ocean, body of the salt water extending from the 60 degrees parallel in the south to the Arctic in the north and lying between the continents of Asia and Australia on the west and North America and South America on the east. Of three major oceans, the Pacific is by far the largest, occupying about one-third of the surface of the globe. Its area, excluding the South China Sea, encompasses about 62.5 million square miles. It has double the area and more than double the water volume of the Atlantic Ocean, the next largest division of the hydrosphere, and its area more than exceeds that of the whole land surface on the globe. The Pacific Ocean stretches from the Bering Strait to 60 degrees latitude through more than 120 of latitude, nearly 9,000 miles. Its greatest latitudinal extent measures some 20,000 miles along latitude 5 degrees between the coast of Colombia in South America and the Malay Peninsula in Asia. The mean depth of the Pacific is 14,000 feet, and its greatest known depth is 36,000 feet. In the Mariana Trench, also the greatest depth found in any ocean. In the northern hemisphere, the Pacific Ocean meets the Arctic Ocean in the Bering Sea. In the southern hemisphere, the Pacific and Atlantic mix in the relatively narrow Drake Passage between Tierra del Fuego in South America and Graham Land in Antarctica. And the Pacific Ocean and the Southern Ocean meet at 60 degrees parallel. The separation between the Pacific and Indian Oceans is less distinct, but generally it is considered to lie along the line of islands extending eastward from Sumatra through Java to Timor, thence across the Timor Sea to Cape Londonderry in Australia. To the south of Australia, the boundary extends across the Bass Strait and thence from Tasmania to 60 degrees. Because of the pattern of major mountain systems of the globe, a relatively small proportion of the total continental range enters the Pacific, a total drainage area of less than about 3 times the total area of Australia. Of the rivers that drain into Pacific south of China and Southwest Asia are of the greatest importance. The basins of those rivers support more than 1/4 of the world's population. The eastern boundary of the Pacific is associated with the American Cordilleran system, which stretches from Alaska in the north to Tierra del Fuego in the south. Except for its extreme northern and southern sections, which are characterized by fjords and their numbers of flying islands, and except for the deeply indented Gulf of California, the coastal boundary is relatively regular and the continental shelf narrow. The western or Asiatic coastal boundary, in contrast, is irregular. Also, the mountain systems that lie roughly parallel to the coast, as they do on the eastern Pacific coastlands. The western Pacific is known for its many marine seals. From north to south, they include the Bering Sea, the Sea of Okhotsk, the Sea of Japan, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. Their eastern boundaries are formed by southward jutting peninsulas or island arcs or posts. It is of oceanographic significance that the great rivers of Eastern Asia included the Amur, the Huanghe, the Yangtze, the Xi and Pearl, and the Mekong enters the Pacific indirectly by way of the marginal seas. This article treats the physical and human geography of the Pacific Ocean. For discussion of the physical and chemical oceanography and marine geology of the Pacific Sea Ocean. Physiography relief. The Pacific Basin may conveniently be divided into three major physiographic regions: the Eastern, Western, and Central Pacific regions. Eastern region. The Eastern Pacific region, which extends southward from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, is relatively narrow and is associated with the American Cordilleran system of almost unbroken mountain chains, the coastal ranges of which rise steeply from the western shores of North and South America. The continental shelf, which runs parallel to it, is narrow, while the adjacent continental slope is very steep. Significant oceanic trenches in this region are the Middle America Trench in the North Pacific and the Peruchil Trench in the South Pacific. Western region. The seaward boundary of the Western Pacific region is marked by a broken line of oceanic trenches, extending from the Aleutian Trench in the north through the Kuril and Japan trenches and southward to the Tonga and Kermadec trenches, terminating close to the noses of North Island, New Zealand. Its structure is more complex than that of the eastern region. Characteristically associated with the ocean trenches of the western region are festoons of either peninsulas or island or both. The islands, which include those of Japan as well as numerous smaller islands, represent the upper parts of mountain system that rise abruptly from the deep ocean floor. The island clusters of the Western Pacific form the boundaries of the several wide and deep continental seals of the region. Central region. The Central Pacific region lies between the boundaries of the eastern and western regions. The larger and the most geologically stable of the structural provinces of the Earth's crust, it is characterized by expansive areas of low relief, lying at the general depth of about 15,000 feet below the surface. Principal ridges and basins to the east of longitude 150 degrees. The relief of the ocean floor is considerably less pronounced than it is to the west. In the eastern Pacific, the Cocos Ridge extends southwards from the Central America isthmus to the Galapagos Islands. To the south of the Galapagos lies the Peru Basin, which is separated by the extensive Sala Gomez Ridge from the Southeast Pacific Basin, which it in turn is separated from the Southwest Pacific Basin by the East Pacific Rise, and intermediate Pacific Antarctic Ridge, which runs from the Sala Gomez Ridge to Antarctica in the vicinity of 150 degrees. Extending southward from the Tasman Basin between New Zealand and Eastern Australia is the Macquarie Ridge, which forms a major boundary between the deep waters of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The Hawaiian Ridge extends westward from Hawaii to the 180 degrees meridian. The submerged parts of the series of ridges that are capped by the island archipelagos of the Western Pacific are continuous and are to be found at depths of less than about 2,000 feet, 610 meters. The ridges include the Aleutian Ridge in the northwestern Pacific. The series of ridges extended southward through the Kuril, Bonin, and Mariana Island groups and the archipelagos of Yap and Palau. Those extending eastward from New Guinea, including the Bismarck Archipelago and the Solomon and Santa Cruz Island chains. And finally, the ridges extending southward, from which rise the Samoa, Tonga, Kermadec, and Chatham Islands groups, as well as Macquarie Island. Bottom deposits. Apart from the narrow coastal dome of the eastern region and the broad continental seas of western region, the Pacific is flooded with pelagic, oceanic material derived from the remains of marine plants and animals that once inhabited the waters lying above. Red or brown radiolarian ooze is found along the zone of the Pacific North equatorial current, east of longitude 170 degrees, and on the floors of some deep Indonesian basins. A belt of diatom ooze occurs between latitude 45 degrees and 60 degrees and across the North Pacific between Japan and Alaska. Calcareous globigerina ooze occurs in the shallower parts of the South Pacific. The dissolving power of the said water at great depths being sufficient to dissolve calcareous materials to such an extent that these oozes are not generally found at depths in excess of about 15,000 feet, 4,600 meters. Silica containing material such as radiolarian and diatom ooze is found at greater depth, but even this siliceous remains undissolved at very great depths, while the characteristic deposit is red clay. Red clay, which covers no less than half of the Pacific floor, is believed to be formed of colloidal, extremely finely divided clays derived essentially from the land. On the abyssal plains, where sediments accumulate slowly, chemical and biological processes lead to the formation of metal-bearing coatings around objects such as the ear-bones of fishes. The noodles so formed contain magnesium, iron, nickel, copper, cobalt, and traces of other metals such as platinum. They cover large areas of the ocean floor in the Pacific. Similar processes form coatings called manganese crusts on the rock surfaces of seamounts. Among the many different forms of land-derived mounds formed by the erosive action of rivers, tides, and currents that follow the continental shelves and slopes of the Pacific, the yellow mud of the Yellow Sea is of particular interest. The mud is conveyed to the seabed by the Huanghe, which drains a vast area of northern China, blanketed with lawns of fine-grained soil. Islands. The islands of the western region, including the Aleutians, the Kurils, the Ryukyus, Taiwan, the Malay Archipelago, and New Zealand, are continental in character. Geologically, they consist partly of sedimentary rocks, and their structures are similar to those of the coastal mountain ranges of the adjacent continent. A geologically important boundary between the continental or high islands and the numerous truly oceanic or low islands of the Pacific is the andesite line, a region of intense volcanic and seismic activity. In the northern and western Pacific, the andesite line follows close to seaward the trend of the island arcs from the Atlantic southward to the Yap and Palau arcs, thence eastward through the Bismarck, Solomon, and Santa Cruz archipelagos, and then southward through the Samoa, Tonga, Enchantment Groves, and Macquarie Island to Antarctica. Islands to the west of the line are rich in andesite, a type of intrusive igneous rock. Islands to the east, oceanic side of it are essentially of basalt and extractive igneous rock. The numerous oceanic islands of the Pacific are unevenly distributed. They lie in the main between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn and occur in great numbers in the western Pacific. The northernmost chain of oceanic islands is associated with the Hawaii Ridge. The Hawaiian archipelago consists of about 2,000 islands. Also, the term Hawaiian Islands is usually applied to the small group that lies at the eastern end of the archipelago. The numerous small islands of Micronesia lie mainly north of Equator and to the west of the 180 degrees meridian. Nearly all are coralline. The principal groups are the Marians, the Marshalls, the Carolines, Kiribati, and Tuvalu. Geology. Evidence drawn from various geophysical fields, seismology, volcanology, gravimetry, and paleomagnetism, points to the general validity of the theory of plate tectonics. All the major physical features in the Pacific are understood to originate in plate tectonics. The Western Pacific arcs of volcanic islands and deep trenches are convergent zones where two plates are colliding, one being subducted. The East Pacific rise is an active spreading center where new crust is being created. The northern East Pacific margin is the strike slip zone where the American plate and the Pacific plate are gliding laterally past each other via the major San Andreas fault system. In the southeastern Pacific, however, the Nazca plate and the South American plate are colliding to form the Andes Mountains along western South America and a short distance offshore the Paruchil Trench. The floor of the northeast Pacific is remarkable for its several major fracture zones, which extend east and west and which in some instances are identifiable over distances of south miles. Of great geologic interest are the sea mounts, geodes, and ocean islands of the Pacific. The numerous tropical islands of the Pacific are mainly coralline. The principal types of coral reefs, fringing, barrier, and atoll, as well as the geodes which rise within the Pacific from the ocean floor in latitudes north and south of the tropics, are explained partially by the slow subsidence theory advanced by the English naturalist Charles Darwin during the 19th century and partially by the theory of plate tectonics. The Western Pacific arcs of volcanic islands and deep trenches are convergent zones where two plates are colliding, one being subducted, forced under the other. The East Pacific rise in active spreading center where new crust is being created. Okay, guys, that's it for today. Bye bye.